Hey there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So this is a bit of a different video for me, but Donkey Kong 64 is one of my favourite games of all time. I know that's a bit of a controversial statement, especially by modern standards, but it's such a nostalgia trip for me. I grew up playing this game on my brother's Nintendo 64, and I have been replaying it at least once a year for the past few years. The biggest highlight for me being all of the boss fights. After a recent playthrough, I decided to do a ranking of these bosses. Now, I know there is a smaller spider boss in the Fungi forest, which is a lot of fun, but as it's not an end of world boss fight, I'm leaving it out of this video. Without further ado, let's get on with the ranking. Now, it probably seems weird that I'm placing a follow-up fight in last place, but there isn't a lot about this boss fight to love. I've always found the armadillo to be kind of a lackluster choice for a boss. I don't really feel like the follow-up does anything more interesting over the original fight at the beginning. The only sense of higher stakes is the additional moves the armadillo has. In addition to the original cannons, it ground pounds the floor, requiring you to jump out of the way to avoid damage, along with a much larger cannon on its back which shoots several fireballs in unison which can easily be dodged, concluding with a large missile that chases you. My biggest issue is that it feels so bland. There's nothing about this boss fight which feels unique to a specific character, in this case Donkey Kong. By this point in the game, the Kongs have the majority of their moves, so the developers could have included something specific to the character to make it more distinct and enjoyable. To me, it feels like a lazy filler boss. Now, this one feels like a slightly better introduction to the bosses of this game. Aesthetically, the giant dragonfly boss surrounded by lava fits the level well. In terms of the gameplay, it feels a lot more fast-paced than the first boss in the game, but apart from that, it doesn't add all that much. Now, Diddy Kong and the flying mechanic is a major staple of this level, so I think they should have incorporated a flying section to the fight, especially considering this boss can fly as well. I think they could have had some rings or something to fly through, and then rocks could have fallen onto the boss, or something like that. Much like other boss fights, the main bulk of the combat requires the player to throw bombs at the boss, causing it to fall into lava. The only sense of threat and urgency comes from the speed at which the fireballs hit you. As far as boss fights go, it's okay, but I think that comes down to my own personal preference of the boss design and movement. So, yes, the first Armadillo boss fight is higher up on the list, but I think that's because, as a World 1 boss, it serves its function much better. This early on in the game, Donkey Kong barely has any moves or abilities, so something as simple as throwing bombs at a boss fits effectively. It's basic, but harmless. Assuming the demographic was a younger audience, this boss fight feels like the easy gateway to the game with the right amount of challenge. The hardest thing the player will have to face is the fireballs, which can easily be avoided. I think the biggest letdown to this boss fight is its replayability. As I've gotten older, I've found just how slow this boss fight really is. Whenever it retreats into its shell and chases you, it feels like it's pulling to a halt. It's so boring and such a sludge to get through. Of all the repeat boss fights, this feels like the most fleshed out and superior version of them all. Chunky Kong goes up against the dragonfly again. But unlike other fights, there are additional stages which makes it feel more unique and distinct over the original fight. So, much like the original fight with Diddy, the first half of the boss requires you to throw bombs at the dragonfly and knock it into the lava. But this one is so much better, as the second half requires Chunky Kong to use one of his abilities to punch the dragonfly several times into the lava. There is a real sense of time to this one as the arena slowly seeps into the lava. It's a clever way of tying the arena into the fight while adding a real sense of urgency as well. It would be all too easy to have a timer on the top of the screen, but I think this way makes it all the more immersive. This is the right way to build on an existing boss fight and make it better. Now, this boss arguably feels like the most unique of any other in the game. The mechanic of this fight requires Lanky Kong to drive around in a little boat to hit DK spots, which makes electrical towers rise from the water. Once you have gone through 5 of them, it will electrocute the pufferfish. The difficulty of this one comes from the fleeting amount of time you have to hit the spots each round. To some extent, it feels like time is the real boss here, and I'm not gonna lie, running out of time is very frustrating, especially as you're getting close to beating the boss. An interesting thing I only realised on this playthrough is the closer you get to the boss, the more space you have to see the spots, but the more likely it is you'll take damage. I think the boss works and matches the water theme of the level, but I'm not too sure about the boat. Given that Lanky becomes a fish and has to jump through rings during the level, I think they could have easily implemented that instead, but it's still a fun and scary boss. First of all, I love this boss. Conceptually, it is ridiculous, funny, and amazing. The Kongs all team up to fight a giant cardboard cutout of King K. Rool. At first glance, the boss just feels like a screw the audience joke, as it's a possibility of a final boss until you realise what it is. I mean, what other game would have a cutout be a boss? If I wasn't trying to be as objective as possible, I would put this in first place. So the point of this one is simple. Use cannons to launch yourself at the cutout to knock it down. You have to hit it 9 times, every 3 times you hit it, part of the cutout falls down and deteriorates. This one is interesting as you can use any of the Kongs you wish, but if you launch yourself over the wall, you effectively lose a Kong and a life. The struggle comes from timing. You have to watch the lights and walls so specifically to make sure you hit the cutout properly. Otherwise, you'll lose a Kong. That's the only real difficulty to that boss. Enemies spawn, but they don't do all that much. I think the great thing about this boss is how charming and quirky it is. Nothing feels more British to me than this boss. Now, I'm sure a lot of you will find this weird and would probably put it in top place, but I think the K. Rool final fight is comfortably second. This is a really solid fight. It cleverly interweaves all the moves and abilities the Kongs have learned over the course of the game and puts all of them to the test. The fight is basically a massive boxing match, which is split into 5 rounds, each of them tackled by a different Kong. It's a good finale to the game and feels grand enough, but I think it's a bit too long. I think each Kong should have issued 2 or 3 hits per round against K. Rool. Otherwise, it just feels a bit too much, especially if you die or run out of time and have to repeat the whole thing. It ends with one final punch from Chunky, which makes sense as he's the strongest Kong, but equally I think Donkey Kong should have issued the final hit as he is the main protagonist of the game. Apart from those minor points, it's a very strong boss fight and is a good representative of just how large this game is overall. Which brings me to the best boss of the game, Mad Jack. First of all, I think this Jack in the Box is arguably the most iconic boss of the game and possibly all of Rare. It feels like such an intimidating threat and ties Tiny's main move mechanic into the fight perfectly. In concept, it's simple. You fly from platform to platform, avoiding the Jack in the Box and pressing buttons. The arena is separated into platforms of blue and white. The objective is to wait for Jack to land and match the corresponding platform and buttons in order to shock him. With each passing round, the fight intensifies through Jack's speed and moves, his laser move requiring near perfect timing to avoid in order to hit the button. As I said earlier on, I think the appeal for this boss comes from the design. He is absolutely terrifying in the best possible way and matches the Frantic factory theme. This may come down to some personal preference, but I find this to be the most replayable boss and the point of the game I look forward to the most. That's just my thoughts though. Where would you rank these boss fights? Do you agree or disagree? Please let me know in comments down below. If you enjoyed what you saw, then could you please hit that like button and subscribe? It helps with the YouTube algorithm. Stay close as I try to post new content every single week.